Hi, everyone. Welcome back to dinanddaf. This is Elana Stein Hain, and what we are going to talk about today is the concept of omdana, assessing someone's intention when they are involved in a transaction. The reason why I want to bring up this concept is because in Bava Batra, Kuf Lamed Aleph Amud Bet, we start the conversation about a husband who is on his deathbed, who writes all of his nechasim, all of his possessions to his wife. And essentially, we assess that what he means by that is he wants to make her the custodian of his materials. Then you continue on to Daf Kuf Lamed Bet Amud Aleph, and we start getting into other conversations about assessing someone's state of mind or intention, really, in what they're doing when we talk about situations where a woman is given a gift from her husband, or the children are given a gift from the husband, and so is the woman. And the question is the wife mochelet? Is she waiving her rights to collect her ketubah from those other gifts? And that's also a situation of umdana. It's also a situation of where we're trying to assess her intention. So whether we're assessing his intentions of what does he mean by giving a gift, or whether we're assessing her intentions, is she waiving her right to collect her ketubah payment from a gift that she receives? Clearly, the concept of umdana, of assessment without verbal, explicit explication of what's going on, is a major topic in this elongated sugya. And so, what I wanted to do is I actually wanted to talk about how the concept of umdana, that we assess someone who's involved in a transaction, we assess what they mean, what the parameters are for that transaction without them actually saying it. How do we define where that applies and where it doesn't? And I mean to say, are there limitations on that? Because I understand that we may look at somebody engaging in a transaction and be able to tell, well, it's probably that they're doing it because of X, and if X doesn't obtain, then maybe it shouldn't apply. Or they're probably thinking, I'm not going to collect my Ktuba money from this gift that I just got. But how do we really know? And so this whole question of assessment, I think, is very slippery and interesting because from a legal standpoint, don't you need people to be explicit about what it is that they are doing? And when do we say, no, you don't need to be explicit? We actually can kind of figure it out. I want to also mention that the Gemara on Kuf Lamed Bet Amud Aleph actually does describe a really interesting Tana'it case, which is somebody who writes all of their um, possessions to other people who are not their heirs because they think their son is dead. And then it turns out, oh, he found out that his son is alive. So obviously, we can omdin da'ato, we can probably assess that when he gave away all his possessions, he didn't think his son was alive, and that's the only reason he did it. And so that mecher, that sale should, excuse me, that matana should be null and void, presumably, right? So there's another example where umdana seems to be um, you know, at work. So let's see what the parameters are of this. I want to do two basic, I want to look at two basic examples that may challenge the ability of umdana to apply in every case. Okay. And by looking at those two examples in the Gemara and elsewhere, it will help us think through what the parameters of umdana should and should not be. So I'm just going to share my screen. Okay. Let's take a look. The first example that I want to look at, and let me just fix this. The first example that I want to look at, and here's the Gemara in Bava Batra quoting on Kuf Lamed Bet Amud Aleph, quoting that situation of somebody who gave away all their possessions thinking that their son was dead, just to give us a little bit of a hook within our Bava Batra, our Daf Yomi learning. But I want to look at the Gemara in Ketubot. Okay, the Gemara in Ketubot, Mem Zayin Amud Aleph, Mem Zayin Amud Bet, quotes a Mishnah, Nitz Armelau, Nitz Garsha, if a woman is widowed or divorced, right? Bein min hanisuin, bein min ha'erisin, govat hakol. whether she was divorced from marriage or she was divorced from being betrothed only, she should be able to collect all of her ketubah payments. Anything that he added into the ketubah, in addition to what is usually given to a betula, somebody who's a virgin, which would be 200 um, dinars, or for somebody who's an almana, somebody who's not a virgin, but presumably somebody who's a widow, somebody who's not a virgin would be 100 dinars, but sometimes people go above that. So can she collect the whole thing when they get divorced or if he dies, whether it was that they were married or they were simply betrothed? So Tanakama says she can collect the whole thing, but Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah disagrees. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah omer min hanisuin govatako. If they were married, then she can collect the whole ketubah, not just the 200 or the 100. But min ha'erusin, if they were only betrothed and they either got divorced or he died, betula gova matayim v'almana maneh. Then they go back to the regular standard numbers, and a betula can only collect 200 dinar, and an almana can only collect 100. And the Gemara explains essentially this the Gemara explains the continuation of the Mishnah basically explains that this is kind of an umdana, right? Shelo katavla ela alminat lekonsa. He only wrote an additional amount because he thought he was going to marry her. But if they only were betrothed, essentially, we assess that he didn't mean to give her extra if they were only going to be betrothed. The reason why he was giving her extra is because he assumed they were going to be married. And therefore, she shouldn't get the extra. That's Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's opinion, right? So that actually seems very consonant with the concept of umdana, the way that we said it. But the Tosfot have a question, because Tosfot essentially say, wait a second, if that's the case, that in a situation where a couple is going to get married and they get betrothed, and he writes in the ketubah, not just 200 zuz, but more, and if they never get married because he dies or they get divorced, then she doesn't get to collect that more, then that may have hashlachot, that may have consequences for other cases that seem parallel to that from a legal standpoint. Let's take a look. So first, Tosfot say, Ein litmoa b'sfarazo, don't be thrown off by this logic. To become a mikomot b'shas matzinu kain, makes perfect sense that he only wrote this to her in order to be married, because he thought they were actually going to have nisuin. The im tomar, but if you ask, im kain, if this is the case, and you'll pardon the parallel that's about to come, because the parallel is about to be about buying and selling, and comparing that to marriage is such a comfortable space, right? But im kain, if so, kol adam halokech para mechavero, anybody who buys a cow from their fellow, v'nitrofa ometa, and it becomes a trefa, or it dies. Anan sade, maybe we should say that we are witnesses, meaning umdana, shalom manatke lakacha, that this person didn't buy it if it was going to die, right? Like imagine I buy a cow, it dies 2 months later. Who intended that? I didn't intend that when I bought it, right? So maybe we should say, umdin da'ato, we assess the mindset of the buyer that they didn't buy it thinking that something was going to happen to it. Now, we have to suggest that what's going on here is that everybody did their due diligence, and maybe this is a case of onus that something happened to it, right? We're not talking about that the seller hid some information or they didn't go through the proper processes, right? We have to assume. So you might think that this would be similar to the case, again, not loving the comparison, but legally speaking, it holds water, right? Where somebody promised ketubah money because the plan was that they were going to get married, and they never got married because he died or got divorced, and they get to renege on the extra ketubah money. How is this any different? Why can't the lokeach here in the para case renege? So Omer Rabbeinu Yitzchak, so the re is quoted to Hobel ve'eno talui ela benotain yesh lanu lalechet achar dato. Says there's a big difference in terms of when we use umdana if the whole situation depends on the perspective of one party, or if it depends on the perspective of two parties. In a situation where he's writing a ketubah and he's writing extra in the ketubah, that is actually primarily, if not completely, dependent on his perspective in giving more, right? The kevan shebo talui, and because it is only dependent on him, v'dai eno rotze likanes b'shum safek. He clearly is not interested in, I want, I'm willing to give this, even if there's a possibility that I might die or we might get divorced. That's not his mindset. His mindset is, I'm giving this because we're going to get married, right? How is this different from lahavdil, the situation of buying a para and then it dies mysteriously 2 months later? It's not similar to somebody who buys something and some onus happens, some force majeure happens. In that situation, we don't say, well, the person who bought it never would have wanted this to happen, and therefore they didn't want to buy it for this purpose, for it to die 2 months later. Why not? Because it's not only dependent on the consumer's mindset and the consumer's planning here. There's also the thought process of the seller, right? There's no way that the seller would sell this based on that dot of the koneh, that the koneh can just return it if a force majeure happens to it, right? So here what you see is maybe an important limitation on umdana, on when we assess, is if there are multiple perspectives that have to be assessed in defining a transaction. And I also want to notice, this wasn't said explicitly, but essentially the reason why we don't think the seller would agree to such a thing is because she stands to lose, right? Like if the seller stands to lose, she would never agree to, oh, and if lightning strikes this cow in 2 months, you can give it back, right? Then the seller is left with a dead cow or a shreifa cow. She's now lost money, right? So why would she do that? So essentially what we have is it's it's dependent on the dot of two people. And especially if one of those people stands to lose, you can assume that they would not have agreed to this. So that's one important limitation on umdana, and where we might make an assessment. Now, how do you figure out which transactions are transactions that depend on the mindset of one party versus transactions that depend on the mindset of both parties? Well, that's exactly the rub, right? Trying to figure out and trying to argue, when does it apply to only one party and when does it apply to both parties in terms of what we care about in the dot. A second challenge comes to umdana, not from the situation of where there are two parties whose dot matters and one of them stands to lose, but actually from a different klal, from a different rule in the Gemara, which is found in Kiddushin Memtet Amud Bet. Hahu gavra dezabin lenichse adata lemesach la'eretz Yisrael. If somebody who sold, their property, thinking that they were going to make aliyah, uve'idna dezabin lo amar v'lamidi, but when they were making the sale, they didn't say anything about that, so they didn't make it explicit. So are we going to assume that they only sold this because they were going to Eretz Yisrael, and if they don't end up going to Eretz Yisrael, then maybe it should be null and void because umdana, that's how we assess the person's mindset. The Gemara says, Amar Rava, Rava says, nope. Habe dvarim shebalev, udvarim shebalev einam dvarim. These are matters of the heart, right? These are like words in the person's heart. They weren't said out loud. And words that were in the person's heart, they don't matter in a transaction. Whoa, 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 whoa. The whole concept of umdana is that somebody didn't say something verbally, and yet we assess that this was their dot when they made it. And if their dot is not upheld, then it should be null and void. And now you're telling me dvarim shebalev einam dvarim, that which remains inside and isn't spoken verbally doesn't affect the transaction? Well, that is a big stira. That seems to be a big contradiction, right? Make up your mind. Does what the person feels inside but doesn't say matter, or plans inside but doesn't say matter, or does it not, right? Really interesting. So the Meiri goes for at least one of his suggestions. The Meiri goes for a very nuanced difference. And it doesn't say, it's not like there's a machloket in general, whether it's dvarim shebalev inam dvarim or not. Whether you do umdana or you do dvarim shebalev and you put these juggernauts against each other and they're actually arguing. It's, well, let me tell you about this case of where the person sold their possessions to go to Eretz Yisrael. He says, well, maybe below od ela shebe'elu shehuzkuru kan, maybe the examples that are mentioned here, and I think if I'm not mistaken, he's referring to other examples and not just the example in the Gemara that we just looked at. Maybe in this situation, hama'ot mafki'in et ha'omed. Maybe the fact that this person received money, they sold their items, not they gave them as a gift, they sold it and they received money, maybe that overrides the assessment of the fact that she was just selling because she's making aliyah. Why? Maybe the receiving money actually causes a person to decide to become amenable to something that they originally didn't plan, right? So originally I was going to sell this stuff only because I was making aliyah. And it turns out I got money for it. And it's true, I'm not going to make aliyah, but I'm happy that I got the money for it. And therefore, we can't necessarily assess that it's that we should void the transaction, right? So that's another suggestion from the Meiri. Maybe there's a difference between when you give something away, where we might void the transaction. If you had given away all your stuff because you were making aliyah, maybe we would say that transaction is void and you can get it all back. And when you make money off of it, because money may change your mind, right? So that's another interesting limitation on umdana. Are there interests that might override what your original intention was? Now, the Ritva suggests something different. And I would say it's a little bit more global, right? And the Meiri also alludes to this in other places, but meaning within that same section. But I only gave you a specific piece of what he said. The Ritva goes for something more global. Says, well, let me tell you, umdana demukha, right? An umdana that is so clear, right? And he's quoting the Gemara in Bava Batra, shiny is different than a situation where the umdana is not so, ironclad. Perish, he says. Let me explain. Tahi degabe beno umdana demuchach l'chol ha'olam. Says, when we're talking about the situation of what we quoted before from our Daf Kuflam and Ben and Aleph, that somebody gave away their possessions because they thought their son was dead. That is an assessment that is proven to everyone. That the only reason this person gave these things away is because they heard that their son died. And believed that the son was dead. Right? And when we say Devarim shebalev inam devarim, that we don't count what's going on in a person's heart that they didn't make verbally explicit. Shiny hacha, it's different in the case of the father who gave away all of his nechasim because he thought his son was Rahman al dead. Why? Shehim dvarim shebalibo uvelev kol adam, right? Because those are words that are both in that father's heart and in everyone's heart. In other words, all people would be in that same mindset. And that's the major difference. When do we say dvarim shebalev einam dvarim? When it's not something that any person who was going through X would think. But if it is something that any person who is going through X might think, we don't just call it dvarim shebalev, we call it dvarim shebelibo ubalev kol adam. Right? Everybody would think it, right? So that's an interesting question. If somebody sold their stuff and they were about to make aliyah, would everybody say, oh, of course, I only sold my stuff for that? Or would they say, well, I was looking to get new stuff anyway, right? Meaning it could be that there are other ways of thinking about this, right? So far we have three limitations on umdana. One is where you have the dot of another person that is definitive as well, and they stand to lose. Another is the possibility that if something involves getting money that may actually override, that interest may override the person's original intention. And third, it's possible that there are some things that are so universal and there are others that are less universal. And if they're so universal, then it's umdana demuchach and we follow it. And if it's not, then we don't. I want to just note that dvarim shebalev inam dvarim is definitely one issue for umdana, but I also think there are two other concepts to think about that show up in the Gemara in various places. One is what we call gilui milta, right? You have to just say what it is that you're doing. And that, in some ways, when we say dvarim shebalev inam dvarim, as long as the person said, oh, I'm doing this because I plan to move to Israel, then that would be a gilui milta, right? They would have revealed to us their reasoning, and maybe that would have been enough. But there is another concept called t'nai kaful, right? If you've learned Gittin, you know that there are some things where when you make a t'nai, if you're going to make a condition on something, like a condition, I'm only selling this if I'm moving to Israel, you have to do a t'nai kaful. You have to double, meaning I'm only doing this if X, and if not X, I'm not doing this, right? So it's interesting to note, and Tosfot actually on I think it's on Kiddushin Memtet Amud Bet. It's interesting to note that the Balei Tosfot help us realize that there are sort of three lanes for the question of assessment versus verbal, having to be verbally explicit. And it goes like this in number 7. You have to make a distinction and say, right? There are some things that clearly don't need a full, conditional statement that's doubled. If yes, then yes, and if no, then no. Danan sadi dadate dahachi avid. Because once they do the gilui milta, once they've revealed in some way that this is why they're doing it, we all see that this is why they're doing it, right? V'gam yesh dvarim da'afilu gilui milta lo bai. And there are also things that don't even require somebody to verbally say something, let alone a t'nai kaful. Kigon, for example, ahi dekotev kol nechasav la'acherim v'shama sheyesh lo ben, shamatana betela. Like the situation where a person wrote all of their nechasim over to somebody and then heard that they have a son, or maybe heard that their son is alive, and the matana is void. V'chein hakotev kol nechasav li'ishto. Likewise, a person, a shchiv meira, someone who's on their deathbed, who writes over all of their possessions to their wife, lo asa ela apotropa, that he only made her a custodian. Lefisha anu umdin shilakach hayabitato, because we assess that that's what was in his mind. So in other words, there are actually 3 tracks. There are some situations where you need a t'nai kaful. You need an explicit condition that says, if yes, yes, if no, this is void, in order for us to consider that to be a binding factor or variable. There are other situations, like a person who's selling in order to move to Israel. There are other situations where you actually just need some sort of gilui milta. You need something to be said explicitly, but you don't need it to be made as a particular condition on the sale. Okay, not a condition, but I'm moving to Israel, which is why I'm doing this, something like that. And there are other things where actually umdana we can assess even without anybody saying anything, even without a gilui milta. So hopefully what this allows us to do is recognize that the role of subjectivity, right? The role of a person's inner intentions is actually really difficult to engage from a legal standpoint, right? You don't want to go overboard where you're always assuming a person's intention and that has legal teeth, because what if you're wrong? And at the same time, you don't want to ignore the likelihood of a person having a particular intention when they do something just because they didn't say it. And it seems like all of these conversations, whether it's trying to figure out, are there two deot here and what would they think? Or it's trying to figure out, are these Durham Shibalev Kol Adam? Or it's trying to figure out, can money change people's minds? It's almost like we're like a sliding scale. And I'm just trying this on for a minute. It's almost like a sliding scale from objective to fully subjective. And what we're trying to do is things that are more fully subjective, that are really diverse among different people, that you need to be explicit about. Things that feel more objective, either because I would say that feel more objective, maybe because they're universal, you might say, right? So they seem more objective, then you have to express less of that out loud in order for us to consider that to be a definitive variable. But suffice it to say, this is not simple. And I think it's provocative to think about. So thanks for learning with me, and I look forward to next time.